The NFL and college football season is in full swing, and BetOnline has you covered with the best odds, biggest promotions, and live in-game betting on all your favorite teams, including the NBA and the NHL. Head to BetOnline today to stay updated on all the action. BetOnline, the game starts here.
No offense, but your brain is a terrible place to keep your big idea. It belongs in the world, but you know that already. You have a calling, a voice that says, "This is what I'm meant to do." Create the website your big idea deserves with Wix. Make it your own with top-to-bottom customization, AI to help realize your vision, and built-in business tools to turn your daydream into your dream job. Wix supports every stage of the business journey except one, your decision to begin. Ready? Go to Wix.com.
Welcome to the Media Roundtable Industry Edition, where we dive into the secrets of the craft and provide our perspective on industry topics in service of marketers responsible for the success of their audio program, the Chief Audio Officer. I'm your host, Giles Martin, EVP Strategy at Oxford Road, and I am delighted to announce and welcome my fellow guest today, Hilary Shafer, VP of Podcast and YouTube Influencer at Veritone One. Welcome, Hilary.
Thank you. Welcome.
Bart Roselli, SVP of Growth at Veritone One.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Bart, for joining. And James Ingrassia, EVP of Client Services at Oxford Road.
Glad to be back. My favorite place to be.
Good to have you here, James, and welcome to the show, everyone. All right, let's get straight into it. Looking at this week's top industry stories. So we're going to start with this article that's been making the news, topic that's been making the news around Spotify. They've been getting some bad press, again, about artists who are saying they're not getting enough of a payout from Spotify. And this is an issue that obviously has come up periodically over the last 5 years, longer perhaps, but it seems to be getting increasing noise. Spotify have been pushing back really against the criticism that it's underpaying artists, arguing that record labels really are the culprits rather than Spotify. They highlighted that they had paid out $10 billion in 2024 to rights holders, and make the point, and it's a good point, that it's really those rights holders, typically the record labels, that decide how that money is distributed. And the reality is most artists have a pretty small share of the royalties from their music. It's often in the 20% range and even lower than that. So, I think Spotify have some legitimacy in disputing this claim, but it's a very difficult situation with them paying artists based on a share of listening, like taking money out of the overall pool. I think the argument that they are favoring large artists is increasingly valid, and they do have a large responsibility here to musicians, I think, and creators. I think the final word here is Spotify, have got so heavily involved in the audio business and in the spoken word business, because it's very difficult for them to make money on music, and the margins just aren't there. And as they're getting the increasing revenue, it goes straight to the labels. And so, Spotify can bat away criticism about this, but the reality is their primary focus and their primary interest is precisely where our CAO's interest is, for the most part, is in those podcasts. So that's my take on it. Just throw it open to the group for any additional comments here.
Yeah.
James, perhaps, or Bart?
Yeah, I have some thoughts on this too. I mean, it's when you actually dig in, it's pretty interesting to see like how the tides have changed. Artists, they make money on touring and merch, and that in music, I think I've read is a lot, unless you're one of the big ones, is actually probably one of the lowest places where you get paid. Spotify, according to the internet, says that they don't start paying you out until you've reached, I think, 1,000 streams of a song. And so think about that. Like, think about a podcast download. You need 1,000 people to download that one episode before you start getting paid out. That's probably a lot for some of these more independent artists. And I would love to see that 10 million number carved out after you take Taylor Swift and Drake and The Weeknd and all of them out of it. Very curious to see what that number looks like, because it's a lot of money. to pay out from Spotify. So I definitely see why they're pushing back. But if that is the backbone of what is making Spotify tick, maybe there's some other agreements that can be made there. It's just it's a very tough place for an artist to be. I even saw that artists Spotify pays if you have a million streams on one song, you get paid between $3,000 and $5,000.
Wow.
So just think about making a living off of that. You'd need probably at least a million streams a month to do that. And if you break that down by day, it's just it's an interesting place. That's why I think so many artists are either going independent because then they get to have all that money, or they're going on tour, or they're doing merch, or they're doing other ways to make some money. So I always try to support artists by not just listening to them and by buying their merch or going to see them live and kind of putting money right in their pockets.
All right, let's move on. So the next article that we wanted to talk about was about YouTube, and it's hit 1 billion monthly podcast viewers, which obviously is a big landmark milestone to hit. And we've been hearing a lot about them, obviously, with the amount of viewing that's happening on TV for podcasts via the YouTube app. And they're really, the momentum continues to grow for these guys. And I thought one of the interesting aspects of this story was about them working on their mid-rolls to ensure that they are making a smoother experience for listeners. So I'm going to hand over to Hilary on this one to share her thoughts on this important story.
Yeah, thanks, Giles. It's a really big milestone, right? I think 1 billion monthly podcast viewers is huge. And I think, the YouTube platform has really changed the game in recent time in terms of just new way for people to consume podcast content. So it's definitely changed the game in that sense. It's absolutely changed the game in terms of discoverability, and just a new way to engage in a more visual manner with these creators and hosts that people have such a strong affinity to. And I think that this milestone really kind of cements YouTube's piece in the equation. I think there's been a lot of grappling going on in the ecosystem about what is YouTube's involvement in the podcasting ecosystem, and how do they fit into the equation here. I think there's no denying that YouTube is here to stay and a big part of the equation now. And I think part of it, to the point you made, Giles, is how they're going to be just how they're focusing on the experience, like, right, listening experience and consumption experience is a huge part of this. That's something we talk a lot about with our partners in terms of like ad load, ad formatting, all of that. So to hear that YouTube is actually going to be making some changes to have a more positive, less disruptive ad environment in video podcast is really good. And I think that's a really positive update to hear. The fact that the programmatic ads that are being served on YouTube won't be as disruptive mid-sentence, mid-thought, that they'll actually find those like more native and natural breaking points within the episode and run there is really great to hear. I think that's, ad technology that doesn't necessarily exist in other platforms, that if we are having more ads here, that at least it is beneficial in terms of the actual consumption process to it all. But just, going back to the 1 billion monthly podcast viewers point, there's a lot of big names that have been utilizing video podcasts, like Call Her Daddy, New Heights, etc. And we're seeing more and more shows layer on video to their shows as a way to just reach new audiences, improve discoverability of their shows, and tap into their fan base in new and creative ways. That obviously has challenges to it, though, right? And I think that's something we should talk about as an industry and continue to point out to partners as this is evolving, because it has an impact on, future monetization. It impacts us in terms of how we're tracking and, assessing performance and success here. And, it does, have a big impact in the long term in terms of how we're going to continue to talk about podcasting in totality. But with that, I'll breathe. Anybody have any feedback or other thoughts to share here? Because this is obviously a big number to be talking about.
Yeah, sure. I think it's interesting because we've all been doing this a very long time. We remember when there was no standardization for what a download was, right? And everybody was like, when are we gonna commercialize, standardize this, because we've proven the concept and we're spending billions of dollars in that. And I think a couple of years ago, Hill, you and I were even chatting. We're like, you would see the stats where it's like 1 in 5 people would discover a podcast on YouTube. It's like at that time they were like, the juice isn't worth the squeeze just yet. We're YouTube. We needed to get to a B number, a billion. And now that it's kind of got there, it's just at the point of you can't ignore it anymore. And people are having to do video with their podcast, which we've been advising for from the beginning, increase tracking performance. But I think the most important thing is that we can now take it a step further on the commercialization piece and be able to make sure the listening environment and the viewing environment is optimized, because that's when the secret sauce hits. And I think we kind of learned that 10 years ago with podcasts when we started to put some framework and standardization and IAB get involved. So the fact that they're coming in now, I think just says we acknowledge it. We want to get behind it. We want to monetize every single penny, and let's make this environment something that is basically now considered traditional media from that perspective. So that's my
Oh,
opinion.
what's interesting too, when I read that headline, is for our chief audio officers listening, is the first thing I thought of was like, well, that's 1 billion impressions that can't be tracked with a pixel every month. And so what does that mean for attribution? Which is why, we at Oxford Road, while pixels are great for audio, we highly recommend that you have your survey in place to make sure that that is capturing people who come through. Or if you're at a video heavy podcast, you're having QR codes on the screen, links in description, pinned comments, the whole list of all the standard practices there. But 1 billion audio impressions essentially are going untrackable with Pixel because of that, which I think is the big takeaway here. And it's a trend that's not going to stop. I imagine that probably might even double by this time next year. So just a note for our chief audio officers listening that please have all your attribution methods up to par on your end.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, James. And it's taking all of those like non-negotiable points that we apply in our YouTube campaigns and bringing them into the audio podcast campaigns now too. The link in the description box, pin comment, QR code on screen if it's available. That should just be table stakes now in these deals.
Thank you for calling out attribution, James. You know I was going to, but I appreciate that. And I won't say more about it. Let's move on to the next story. I'm curious to hear more about this myself, I think from James, who's our resident expert here, because it seems very curious. I have not read much about it. The True Crime Cruise, the immersive mystery experience at sea, featuring some of the true crime Illuminati, really, from all sorts of different shows. Very curious to see the direction this one's going to head in. What are your thoughts on this?
I think this is really interesting, and I'm not too into true crime podcasts. I'll just say that, but I don't feel great about a true crime themed cruise in the middle of the ocean. But I suppose if you're a big fan, this is the one to go to. So next year, a little less than a year from now, on January 26th to the 30th, Norwegian Cruise Line, their Joy ship, is going to have a true crime cruise from Wondery. And Wondery, as we all know, has some of the best true crime podcasts out there. So they're pulling together John Walsh, who we all know from America's Most Wanted. We've got Red Handed, Generation Y, Kill List, Scamfluencers, a bunch of other true crime podcast hosts will be there. And if you want to go, you can go book that now, I imagine, on the true crime, I'm sorry, the Norwegian Cruise Line website. But there's going to be a lot of activities, murder mystery events, workshops, panel discussions, immersive theater, self-defense classes. It seems like this is a really big 360 opportunity to just immerse yourself in true crime. So it's kind of cool to see. I know that the cruise trend has been going for a while, more on the music side. Like they'll get together like the yacht rock bands or the 90s bands or whatever it is. But this is the first time I think that podcasting is setting sail. But it does kind of cap off a trend that we've seen in the last year or two, where some of these shows, like I believe it's Lady Gang goes on tour, Call Her Daddy went on tour last year. And so much like we were just discussing with Spotify, I imagine that this is just another revenue stream for these podcasters who perhaps are looking for more income from their efforts. So It's definitely interesting. Is anyone here going to
Yeah.
book their trip?
No. But I also find it interesting that you're going to put, that if you would have said 10 years ago, and I'd be curious your thoughts, Giles, like that true crime would be such a massive category from podcasts, which is obviously heavily strongly weighted towards the female side, that they would be to a point of monetization cycle that they would start having cruises to get people together. I mean, it just shows you the power, obviously, of audio, but also like these are, if we use the old radio term here, these are P1 listeners times a million. You're going to go on a cruise and get scared out in the middle of the ocean? Like, kudos to you. That's pretty crazy, but that's interesting. Giles, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I'm surprised you haven't signed up, Bart, but clearly it is for the most passionate of true crime enthusiasts. And, I mean, for marketers, it's an amazing opportunity and environment to be in. I mean, it's such, you can't get a more captive audience, than an audience on a cruise. And I wonder what types of branding opportunities there will be, for advertisers out there. And I think it just speaks more generally, and it's akin really to the development in video, where what was once a pure audio play is now becoming an increasingly multi-dimensional sort of media environment, which presents, more and more types of opportunities for advertisers to create integrations, to be creative, and to drive, interesting and deeply engaged, environments to interact with consumers in. So, yeah, really interesting stuff. If any clients are interested, we will certainly find out what type of opportunities there are on a cruise. We can probably get you free tickets if you push enough money towards it.
Have you ever heard of any of these companies? Shopify, Bayer, Oracle, Indeed, Masterclass, Babbel, Tommy John, LegalZoom, Constant Contact. We could go on, and we could go on so much further now that we're joining forces with our friends at Veritone One. We have created the world's largest specialist agency in audio and in podcasting. Nobody's ever done anything like this before, and it's an exciting opportunity for everybody involved. What we do at this agency is we offer comprehensive services for brands that are looking to break out and be successful in this space. We call you the chief audio officer because we believe that what you need requires real specialist work. And the way that we approach it includes proprietary methods in media planning and buying, analytics and attribution, insights. We have a proprietary process called Audiolytics, which is our trademark method for creative development that allows us to score ads for their persuasiveness. Audio isn't just the work that we do, it truly is our passion, and we aim to elevate this industry to new heights. And that's why we're the leaders in brand safety and suitability, as well as in volume in the space. We try to provide solutions that ensure that your ad buys align your values that you have as a brand with your business metrics that you need to be successful. This stuff is hard, but we're here to make it a little bit easier for you. And if you're a chief audio officer seeking best in market performance at maximum viable scale, please get in touch with us. Do the right thing. Go to oxfordroad.com. And if you're passionate about audio, if you're strategic, if you're relentless, and you're looking for a career change, consider joining our mission as an agent of influence. Send us your resume through our website, oxfordroad.com. We made it really easy to spell. Sign up for our free newsletter, The Influencer, and be sure to mention that you heard about us right here on the Media Roundtable podcast, because attribution is important. Thanks, everybody.
All right, let's move on to our main stories now. And the first one is on the important topic of podcast rankers. There have been some shifts in those rankers, reflecting some of the changes in the industry that we've been talking about. Bart, are you going to take us through this one?
Yeah, sure. So this is really exciting. I think this also points to, we as marketers know, like at some point you just hit a point of where things need to evolve, especially from a research perspective. Everything we do is driven off of actionable intel. And as we've just been talking about with YouTube and video and the importance of it being a part of every podcast, now to see SiriusXM and Wondery and likely many more to start to shift away from Podtrack and Triton digital podcast rankers, because the limitation is solely focused in RSS-based downloads. So people are consuming it and discovering it on video to show something that myopically only shows you your audience on from the RSS perspective. And look, some shows we all know like have 70% video views versus maybe 30%. So to see that, I think just more speaks to the next phase of our ecosystem of research. These research tools have served us well for the last decade plus, but now with video being this paramount, we have to, otherwise you have to take it with directional lines in the sand. So I think seeing that from an ecosystem perspective is really important. And look, I don't blame them. I wouldn't want someone to say, hey, take a look at my car, but I'm only, you're only gonna look at 2 tires. Not really probably a fair representation if there's that much kind of being missed, but I'll open it up to the floor here for your guys' thoughts.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good point. I like the car analogy. I think what this just means is that when these reports start to come out, you kind of don't even read them anymore if you know that the big guys aren't in there. So like, I think that this leaves the door wide open for someone to come in with a standardized chart, just like the Billboard Hot 100. Like there's artists who withhold themselves from that. It's just, it is what it is. It's a number of downloads, a number of sales on that end. So I don't have the answer. Maybe if someone listening wants to make some money, you can create what that standard is. And I also think on that note, it would be nice to see that apply to streaming as well. I know streaming is also this big void where we really don't know how many people are listening on a daily basis, on an hourly basis, where they're listening, where they're coming in from, what music they're listening to. You can kind of probably hobble it together with some access points, but I do think that the audio industry, not auto industry, is looking for or is in need of a standardization of charts that we can all kind of point to on that, and probably less so of a opt-in and more of just the numbers from whatever source we all deem reliable.
Yeah, I'd like to get that's a great point, James. And I think it'll be interesting because we talk about this all the time is, audience numbers are one piece. Engagement is very important. We talk about 360 sphere of influence. Like you're not just going to go activate with maybe just the podcast if they've got social and video and other elements. So, it's going to take some time, obviously, to fold that in. But how do you see it kind of like in a perfect world from our buying perspective as we look forward, like to quantifying the value of these influencers to clients? Like, how do you think about it from like just a buying perspective?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And part of what we're doing internally now is looking at people on that influencer level, right, on the creator level themselves, because their sphere of influence is touching more than one channel. And right now we don't have a ranker or metrics necessarily that are quantifying all of the different touch points that they might be looking at or engaging in. And so that we have some work to be done there, I think, as an industry, to figure out how we can really quantify that across the board. I think that this article is interesting and this topic is interesting because rankers have always been directional at best within the podcasting ecosystem. Whether we're talking about iTunes rankers or Triton rankers or Podtrack rankers, like they've never actually been the full story ever. But to see big players opting out of things, I think is sending a message. And I think, James, to your point, it definitely is hammering home that point that we need some better ways at looking at this all in holistically as an industry here. We look at things based off performance, right? Just because something's not on a top 10 ranker doesn't mean that we wouldn't engage or we wouldn't put a lot of value behind it. But a lot of companies do. And so there's reason to have these metrics and these tools out there. And I think that they're very helpful. But yeah, I think as an industry, we got some work to be done here.
Yeah, and I really like what you said, Bart. You sort of touched something in me in a way about these tools, no matter how imperfect they are, as Hilary, clearly stated, they've been the tools that we've grown up with, and they've always been standards that we have looked at and referred to. And it really feels like a new era. And I think it's what you were saying, like it's a sort of really reflecting this evolution in the industry, which has changing so much. And gosh, yeah, I'm going to get a bit nostalgic if I'm not careful. So I think I'm going to move on to the next topic, which is about branded podcasts. And Signal Hill published some research about branded podcasts recently. It's not something that we typically you get deeply involved in, obviously, because That's tends to be more on the production side, but certainly I think would be interesting to a lot of clients and brands potentially. And James has been taking a look at this report and is going to share some thoughts with us.
Yeah, I have some conflicting thoughts on this report here. So Signal Hill kind of came out with this report that basically looked at 15,000 responses from podcast listeners who tuned into branded podcasts. And for those of you who don't know what a branded podcast is, I think the most famous one out there that they always put out there is from Sound That Brands did the Trader Joe's podcast. So if you want to know all behind the scenes of Trader Joe's and how that operation works and tips and tricks and all that, you can listen to that. It's a podcast only about Trader Joe's. That's a branded podcast on that end. I'm sure there's others, other examples too, but that's one of the more famous ones. So this study came out and basically said that of the 15,000 podcast listeners who they surveyed, 61% felt more favorable towards the brand after an episode, which to me sounds really low. Like if you're taking the time to go listen to a branded podcast about a brand, only 61% felt more favorable afterwards. Interesting. I wonder if how it was phrased. Maybe I don't know if they felt less favorable or if they felt the same. And then 75% maintained their attention throughout. So maybe there is some truth from people dropping out there. But I think it's an effective strategy. But I would warn any chief audio officers out there or brand marketers, like only if you have a good story to tell. I don't think every brand needs a branded podcast. I do think if you are very niche, or have a niche offering or stand out amongst a lot of competition, it's probably worth differentiating yourself in that point. But I think it's it's a lot of work. You got to stick with it, unless it's a limited series on that. So I go either way on branded podcasts. I think that they're really cool to have if your brand has a good story to tell. But at the same time, it's not going to be like a revenue driver for you. It's going to be a nice to have. And I don't know beyond companies like Trader Joe's, how long you can keep that engagement going for. Again, there's probably some brands I can, but most probably have a story to tell and has a start, middle, and an end. So curious.
Yeah, we have talked with brands about starting branded podcasts in the past, and obviously one of the attractions of it is the production lift is so low relative to creating your own TV show or whatever it might be, and really opens up this opportunity for brands. But the truth is they face exactly the same challenge as all the other podcasters, is building an audience, and it's really hard work. And you've really got to be ready to commit and see that through if you're going to do it. And I think, if brands are going to go in this direction, it's really important they take stock before they start, make sure that this is something that they're really committed about. And before I hand it off to someone else, may I just make a point about Trader Joe's? Not only do they have a branded podcast, they are the most profitable grocery retailer per square foot in the United States by quite a long way, I believe. Could be coincidence, I don't know, maybe not. And they also collect no data about their customers. They have no loyalty program. And so something to think about for the marketers out there.
The only thing I would say, kind of just echoing James's point, is it's just important to go in with proper expectations of what you're seeking. If you set that, and that's obviously our job to do it, but I think sometimes people are like, oh, I'll do it for 8 or 10 weeks and I'm hoping for this magical change in favorability. From that perspective, that's probably not going to happen that quickly. Maybe it does. That's a long shot, but I think it's to like, what are you trying to accomplish? And is it part of it's a tactic in combination with other elements of your marketing portfolio, not just a standalone from that perspective. And you get to that place for that consideration. A lot of great, cool things you can do, interviews and things of that nature. It has to be met with the right one, or everybody loses from that perspective if you're approaching it with different kinds of sets of expectations up front.
Yeah, and Giles, something you mentioned that I want to touch on too is just, with branded podcast, you have to have a launch strategy behind that. I think the production and the idea are really big pieces of the equation, but actually making sure you're getting in the ears of the people that you want is a whole other part of it, because a branded podcast isn't effective if you're not reaching the audience that you are targeting. Your brand sentiment won't go up, your message won't get out there, and you have to have an actually effective and efficient launch strategy, which takes work and budget. So that's, I think there's many layers that go into if a branded podcast actually makes sense.
It does. We actually had a client that created an internal podcast for their global workforce that actually made its way onto RSS feed. So they actually ended up getting some outside listeners on it. Nothing crazy, but they decided to embrace it and kind of produce it for dual audiences. So there was no trade secrets going on in there, but it was when they essentially distilled the information to their employees, they made sure that anyone listening from the outside would also benefit from it.
Let's move on to the next topic, which is about independent podcasters and content creators more generally, as it may be more appropriate to call them these days. And particularly, the success that they are having monetizing in ways, both in audio, but beyond audio as well. And Hilary is going to give us a little more perspective on this one.
Yeah, thanks, Giles. Well, I'm not a big fan of predictions, as you guys probably know internally, but this was actually a big thing that I was buzzing around at the beginning of the year here. So to see this being such a topic at the On Air Fest last week, I think just shows that this is real, and this is a very clear trend that we're seeing so far in 2025. But independent podcasters, first of all, haven't gone anywhere. It felt like they did because for quite some time, all we were hearing about in the trades are a couple of large players, which I don't even have to name here because you all know who I'm talking about, acquiring shows, taking on, IP, bringing people into their fold. And it was like this battle of who was representing these big shows. And we've definitely lost sight of some of those independent publishers, and they lost less, they kind of are getting less press as a result. But what was really clear at in this article and on Airfest is that, the independent podcasters are continuing to do what they do best, reshaping the industry, connecting with their audiences, building media companies themselves now. So they're even less dependent on these mainstream sales groups or large sales entities to help them with their monetization efforts. And I think that's the hot take here, is that while over the last couple of years there's been a lot of consolidation and evolution of the podcasting ecosystem from a representation and sales perspective, the indie podcasters are still thriving, they're growing, they're evolving, and we're seeing actually a lot of like micro networks starting under creators themselves. And where one show might now be the tent pole, and there's a whole network and sub shows coming out from under them. I think what Mr. Ballin has done with Ballin Studios is a fantastic example of that, in partnership with some large networks, but really kind of doing it themselves. What the Unwell Network has done, I think, is another great example of that too, where they're building on their audience, their creators. And one thing that we touched on in the beginning too is with this indie energy era of podcasting, we're not only seeing content and really good creative ways of just delivering their messages, but you're seeing a lot of the touch back to roots of this channel. There's live shows, live events. They're really tapping into their socials. They're tapping into their core fan base in all of these unique creative ways. So yeah, it's exciting to see that this energy is happening out there, and that there's a lot of engagement and now press and talk and conversation going on about all the work that independent publishers are doing in the ecosystem.
And interesting in the context of the independent films now winning the Oscars.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because we love, like, obviously working from the network perspective, because let's face it, like when you start out, like you're not just going to create your own media company from the beginning, from scratch. Like you need to build a community. You need to kind of get your audience out there. We always say to people trying to start a podcast or influence in any way, it's like, do it because you love it. Don't do it to try to make money just because you see 3 or 4 deals in this space and say, oh, I can make $100 million. It's like, yeah, that's nice, but like, do it for the love of what you're doing. That's where you create influence. That's where you create passion. That's where you create engagement. And that's what brands are looking for. And I think it comes down to, when's the right time? What's the timing of when you want to try to go independent, or if you want to start independent, and then also just like the reciprocity of feedback that we work with partners to say, like, here's what we're looking for, here's what brands get excited about. You also get the ability to kind of create more flexibility, which may not be possible when you're going from the traditional elements with key networks. But let's not all forget, the key networks have reach and ability to create promotion and drive growth. So there's all about timing of when's the right time to do it. But I think everybody knows now. You see Mr. Beast out there with a #1 from a reference perspective, and now that they're on Amazon Prime with like their own show. Like it's pretty crazy to see what we all knew was possible take it to levels we didn't even think was possible.
Yeah, it's really interesting too. I mean, some of my favorite network partners are not network partners. They're independent show producers or the hosts themselves that I'm on text with on a daily basis sometimes. And from our client standpoint, those are great because it's a quick text like, hey, would you guys ever do this on screen? And you get it right back, and then the order goes in and something comes alive on that. But then even having a conversation with one of them 2 weeks ago, they were kind of saying like, yeah, networks really want us on board, but we like the flexibility of just being able to do our own thing, and we get to keep 100% of the revenue that comes in. Back to the Spotify story from the top of the podcast, it's the same thing. If they get to keep 100% of the advertising revenue that comes in. Now they have to do everything on their own, from sales, promotion, marketing on that, but the select few that actually make it past those waves and can kind of get to the smoother water are seeing some pretty big success.
All good?
Yeah.
All right. Our final topic for this week, the BBC moving its podcasts outside the UK to its owned media properties. So if you are a listener in the US or anywhere else in the world outside the UK, starting in the spring, you will only be able to access BBC content on the BBC website or via the BBC Sounds app. And it's not I don't think it's a particularly surprising move. It's obviously very much in line with the trend that the whole industry and the whole media industry is really taking. The BBC wants more control of the content, more direct visibility into the audience, more first-party data, more control over monetization. And why have those third parties intermediating between you and your audience? It might cost them some listeners potentially. It obviously makes access a little bit more challenging, but I wouldn't be surprised if net they come out of this doing better. And it makes sense for them because the BBC, for several years now, they've had a deficit from their license revenue. I think it was £90 million last year. And so they've really got to work hard to leverage this international advertising opportunity as much as they possibly can. And with the extra first-party data and the more direct sales opportunity, there should be more to their margins there. I think for marketers, a couple of things. If you are selling a product that is available in international markets, this type of inventory that's available via the BBC is absolutely something that we would look at recommending for the majority of products. I would say it's quality, trusted content, and absolutely the type of thing that you want to be associated with and that we often see perform very well. I also think with the additional visibility that the BBC are going to have with first-party data, they should be able to offer better quality targeting opportunities, which hopefully should enhance performance as well. So if you are in the international market, certainly worth a look at what the BBC are doing.
I think, Giles, the thing you said there, which is really important, sometimes people forget is, for BBC, it makes too much sense from that perspective, but first-party data, how important is everything we're doing from the data and decision-making they're engaging with the website, the app, a show, etc. It just gives you ways to operate fluidly in like an isolated ecosystem. And to do that, knowing that you're hitting pretty much same type of audience demographic, gives you the ability to kind of dynamically adjust on the fly with what as a target-rich environment.
I agree. It's always nice to see new opportunities come out in the audio space just when you think there aren't any others. So I can definitely see like a BBC run of network coming out of this, or other types of audio video hybrid campaigns coming out of a very trusted source. And Giles, correct me if I'm wrong, because I've never lived over there, but BBC TV has zero advertising, correct?
Yeah, within the UK, there's
So
no
that's
advertising monetization. Yeah.
it's a prestigious brand that now offers advertising to associate with its handle, which is a really big step, which I know that the audio always has, but now bringing it all in-house kind of puts a nice walled garden around it that we could probably do some pretty interesting things on behalf of our clients with.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Bart, Hilary, and James, for taking part in this conversation today and for joining the Media Roundtable. This podcast is brought to you by Oxford Road and Veritone One, where we want you to succeed in audio and creator-based media to use influence for good. As members of the marketing community, we have the power to advance voices that don't just entertain, but edify, to build bridges across differences and preserve fair-minded discussion around the most important topics of our age. If you're a marketer looking to align your brand values with extraordinary business outcomes, reach out to Oxford Road by visiting oxfordroad.com and subscribing to our weekly newsletter, The Influencer. The Media Roundtable would love to hear from you. If you have any feedback or suggestions, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can find us at info@mediaroundtable.com. And before we wrap it up, I have to give another plug to Ad Infinitum. If you haven't listened to Ad Infinitum yet, strongly encourage you to listen to it. It is the world's only podcast dedicated to making excellent performing creative for audio. Hosted by our very own VP of Creative Services, Stu Redwine. He's had a really top-class roster of guests on the show, from brands and marketers to sort of sonic branding experts, to sort of behavioral psychologists, digging into sort of how sound moves the brain and influences us to take action. So encourage you to check that out if you haven't. Started episode 1 to get a better understanding of what makes audio ads work. And again, we would love to hear your feedback. So please check out Ad Infinitum. Season 2 is just wrapped up. Listen wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again to our guests, and also to Haley, Ruby, Bianca, Kyle, Ezra, Mary Jane, Neil, Everett, and the team at Podcast One for making this possible. As always, influence responsibly.
So you've got a business, but what about a brand? The difference? More of you. Wix gives you the freedom to create your website, own your brand, and do it on your own, exactly how you envisioned it. Experience limitless customization. Boost your creativity and efficiency with AI tools for every part of your business journey. Scale up with built-in SEO, e-com, and scheduling features. Put more of you in your business. Go to Wix.com and do it all yourself.